Hello, for the last time this semester, students, we're going to wrap up topic 6 by looking at the effects of the New Deal. In the larger sense, the most important thing to remember is that the New Deal is going to greatly increase the size and scope of the federal government and changes its relationship with the American people to become one that's much more actively involved. One effect of the New Deal is the benefit to unions that things like the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Board will create. The Wagner Act finally acknowledges the right of workers to organize unions and collectively bargain, and the National Labor Relations Board gives them a little bit of a voice in the government as they can bring worker issues to them for arbitration. We'll actually see the number of people in unions double to 9 million Americans during this time period, and the birth of one of our more significant unions, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. The CIO is one of those national labor union organizations organizing smaller unions, and these are industrial unions, so unions of people working all in one industry. And it's created largely out of many industrial workers being fed up with the AFL, which only represented skilled workers intended to excluded people of color. And the CIO is going to represent a lot of unskilled workers and also a much more ethnically diverse workforce. This picture here is one of their first major strikes up in Flint, Michigan, which is a sit-down strike where they sit down at the workplace and prevent anybody from coming in and replacing them. African Americans and women will see some opportunities increase with this. We will see a slightly greater voice in the government representation for these groups, but ultimately the New Deal isn't going to do a lot to address women's rights and civil rights for African Americans. Eleanor Roosevelt, seen here on the right-hand side, with Mary McLeod Bethune, who was also a member of the government. Eleanor Roosevelt is FDR's wife, and she kind of sets the precedent of the actively involved First Lady taking up social and political and even economic causes. She will act as Roosevelt's spokesperson in many cases. She travels over 60,000 miles during Roosevelt's presidency, visiting farms and mines and other workplaces and promoting different aspects of the New Deal, as well as things like health education, arts in rural areas, and so forth. There's the first woman secretary in the cabinet will be Frances Perkins. She will be nominated during the Roosevelt presidency. She will be the Secretary of Labor. She's going to help establish Social Security and bring an end to child labor, as well as adding a minimum wage. However, the New Deal doesn't do a lot to fight gender discrimination in the workplace, and sometimes it reinforces traditional gender roles. The CCC, for example, will not hire women. The WPA was hesitant to hire women into specific jobs that they saw more as men's jobs. And things like Social Security excluded domestic work, which was, of course, much more predominantly a woman's profession. African Americans also will see the similar process here. Bethune is an advisor. She is one of the highest ranking African American members of the executive branch during Roosevelt's presidency, but she is not a cabinet member, although she was part of what was called the Black Cabinet, which was sort of an unofficial group of African American advisors who had access to Roosevelt, which is a step in the right direction, although not as much representation overall in government. But racial discrimination is going to still continue to be a problem, particularly because part of the New Deal coalition supporting these reform movements are white Southerners who do not want to see these things applied to African Americans. And some New Deal programs that we had seen before purposefully discriminated against people of color. Also during this time, there was a push from the NAACP for an anti-lynching law, which Roosevelt is going to refuse to back, not because he doesn't think lynching is a problem, but because he was afraid he was going to lose support from the Southern wing of the Democratic Party. During the New Deal and what's called the Indian New Deal, Native Americans will see their relationship to the government changed pretty dramatically. There's going to be a concerted effort to reverse course from the Dawes Act of 1887. Now, if you recall, the Dawes Act of 1887 divided up Indian reservations into individual plots and gave them to individual families rather than allowing collective control of the land by the tribes. And this led to a severe shrinking in the size of the reservations overall, a lot of the land going to be sold for mining and forestry and that sort of thing. And there was also a concerted effort to suppress Native American cultures. The Indian New Deal will try to reverse course on a lot of that. They restore tribal control over the lands and gave Native Americans more control over their own affairs on the reservations. There will be funding from the federal government for building schools and hospitals and the creation of a CCC specifically for the Native American reservations, as well as a reverse on the cultural genocide and attempts to encourage the practice of Native Americans' religions, languages, and former customs. This is also going to see a major realigning of the political parties in the formation of what's called the New Deal Coalition. Industrial workers, Midwestern farmers, African Americans, Southern whites, urban elites, and others will all kind of be brought in by different aspects of the New Deal that benefit them or speak to their particular points of view into a very solid voting bloc that will be consistently electing Democrats to the House of Representatives as well as to the presidency. FDR will serve 4 terms. He's the only president to do so. Afterwards, they will pass an amendment to prevent this from occurring. And the Democrats will control the majority of the House of Representatives until 1995, except for a few 2-year periods in there. They become a more stronger force there. And this really is sort of a shift in the political alignment of many groups of people. In many ways, the New Deal is going to change the relationship between the American government and its people. And we're starting to see the beginnings of more of a welfare state in the United States, which is never really as developed as it is in many other industrial countries, particularly in Europe. But the idea is that the government assumes responsibility for the well-being of its citizens, particularly for the most vulnerable, the elderly, children, the sick, the unemployed, and so forth. And this is going to set up sort of the conservative liberal political divide of today as they debate over exactly what is the role of the federal government, how much of a role it should have. But the government started doing things it had not done before, like hiring people just for the sake of getting people back to work. We see a picture here of a young man working for the Civilian Conservation Corps, planting trees in the Great Plains area. And the CCC also represents a continuation of the conservation efforts started by Teddy Roosevelt during his presidency. During FDR's presidency, we'll see setting aside of 12 million acres of land for national parks. And an attempt to sort of control the issues, the problems that led to the Dust Bowl. The Tennessee Valley Authority is going to alter the environment with its actions, flooding some areas, which has ecological problems of its own. There'll also be flooding of areas like the Hetch Hetchy Valley in California, which was a national park too. So while they work on some conservation efforts, we also see that the federal government is going to alter the environment in many ways too. Overall, this is the greatest expansion of the federal government's size, scope, and authority in U.S. history. It is a kind of a rejection of the previous laissez-faire policies of an unresponsive government when it comes to the economy, and the government starts to take responsibility for spurring economic growth. And while this is oftentimes criticized, particularly at the time by conservatives as being socialist. In fact, the New Deal does a great deal to prop up and strengthen capitalism. It restores faith in banks, in the stock market, and it develops industry, in infrastructure, and other things in rural areas. It's going to boost wages and therefore the buying power of people at the bottom of the economy. And this is one of the arguments that unions will put forth for more government intervention, is if you put more money in the hands of the workers at the bottom, it's going to stimulate economic growth, because as we know, they're going to do a lot of buying with that. We also see an dramatic increase in the power of the presidency in the executive branch, and this is one that's going to stick. We've seen expansions of executive authority before, but in this one, Congress doesn't do a lot to claw back some of those expansions and take back its power. We create many huge bureaucracies and agencies within the executive branch that are heavily funded and have very little congressional oversight. They're headed by people who are appointed by the president. They are staffed by people who are hired. So there's not a lot of oversight from the people either when it comes to voting for these people. FDR is going to change the style of the presidency, particular in its use of mass media. He was a master of the use of radio as a way of putting out his message, the fireside chats and stuff. And we'll see from this point forward, presidents make use of mass media to speak more directly to the people, and it's almost a necessity for presidents. We'll see it later on with JFK in television, Barack Obama in social media, President Trump even with Twitter. And other forms of mass media as a way to sort of directly communicate with the American people. But overall, remember, this is a big, big expansion of the government in its role, and it's sort of a redefining of our idea about what is freedom. We're not just free because we have limited government involvement. Sometimes an expanded government involvement can make us more free by protecting us and keeping us safe and well off, by being able to afford our necessities, being able to make a decent living, is also another way of defining freedom. When we look at the graphic organizer here, it's very similar to the first lesson's graphic organizer with all the things causing the Great Depression, but here we're looking at effects of the New Deal. So all of these spiral out from the New Deal. There are 9 different boxes there. Each one, I ask you to describe how the New Deal affected it, and then in the explanation part, explain why this is an effect of the New Deal. So make sure it ties back to the New Deal. So for example, if we zero in on labor unions, we know labor unions gained in membership. They actually doubled to 9 million members, as well as political strength. So how is this a result of the New Deal? The Wagner Act gave unions the right to organize. The NLRB gave unions a voice in the government, and this is going to make them more popular and cause them to gain more strength. All right. Je t'aime. Au revoir.